Many of you watching this video are probably somewhat familiar with the Hindenburg disaster. The Hindenburg was a giant airship that was built by Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, and it offered one of the very first practical means to cross the Atlantic by air. Now, what you have to remember is that by the late 1930s, while aircraft had been around for quite a few decades leading up to this point, they still weren't a very practical means to cross the Atlantic with. There were some ways to do it. This usually involved seaplanes, and they would have to make stops to refuel and stuff. So, as I said, if you wanted to have a nice, smooth way of crossing the Atlantic, you basically had two options. There was either the traditional ocean liner, or you could take an airship. And this is exactly where the Hindenburg came into play. The Hindenburg started offering commercial flights across the Atlantic in the year 1936, and for its first year of operation, it was very successful. It was indeed the fastest way to cross the Atlantic. The ship could do it in somewhere between 2 to 3 days. So, while it was an expensive way to travel, it definitely was the fastest. Now, during that time, the Hindenburg had a perfect track record. There were no major disasters with the airship. However, all that changed in the year 1937. On May 6, 1937, as the Hindenburg was completing a voyage from Frankfurt, Germany to Lakehurst, New Jersey, when it was in its final stages of landing, the airship randomly caught fire and collapsed to the ground, engulfed in a massive wall of fire. Now, during the Hindenburg's landing sequence, there were tons of news crews all over the place, so the collapsing and burning of the Hindenburg was well documented. The burning of the Hindenburg is some of the most recognizable historical footage ever to be found. You know, there is so much video of the Hindenburg burning, and honestly, most people who study history have seen the burning of the Hindenburg at least once. Now, I myself was somewhat familiar with the Hindenburg disaster. I knew the basics of it, that it was a giant airship, that it caught fire as it was landing, and so on and so forth. But I did not know the full story of this airship. So what I decided to do for this video was go back and look at the entire history of the Hindenburg so I could tell you all the full story of this very fascinating aircraft. So join me in today's video as we now tell the story of the Hindenburg, the Titanic of the skies. Construction on the Hindenburg began in the year 1931. However, it would take 5 long years before the airship was completed. The airship was being designed and built by this man, Hugo Echner. He envisioned a world where airships were the primary way to travel all around the world. He saw airships as being the next revolutionary stage in the world of transportation. He was designing the Hindenburg to not only be the biggest airship ever built, he also wanted it to be the most luxurious. He literally put his heart and soul into building the Hindenburg, as well as every type of airship that he was ever involved with. Now, there's one very important thing all of you watching this video need to understand about Hugo Echner. He was a very dedicated man to his work, and the one thing he loved to work on more than anything else was airships. He first became introduced to airships in the year 1908, and from the first moment he started messing with them, he loved them. He received his first license to pilot an airship in the year 1911, and then from then on out, he had a very successful career as an airship man. Now, during the First World War, he was involved with training most airship pilots, and then after the war ended, he then decided to pursue his dream to make airships the next viable means of human transportation. His ultimate dream was to see airships doing what ocean liners were already doing, taking people across the Atlantic. However, after the war ended, it didn't take Hugo very long to discover that his dream of building a transatlantic capable airship passenger service would not be an easy one to accomplish. You see, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, it forbade Germany from building airships to the size requirements needed so Hugo could use them for the transatlantic passenger service. However, Hugo didn't let this stop him. After some intense lobbying, he was eventually able to convince the US government to let him build an airship for them. This airship would eventually become known as the USS Los Angeles. After this airship was delivered to the US government, the size restrictions on how big airships could be was waived. So once this was done, Hugo now had the green light to begin work on his next revolutionary airship, an airship that he hoped would be the beginning of a new era in the world of transportation. This airship would soon become known as the Graf Zeppelin, the biggest and most luxurious airship ever built. Now, the path for Hugo Echner to get from the USS Los Angeles to the Graf Zeppelin was not an easy one. This was mostly because he had great difficulty in getting the funding he needed to build the airship. He couldn't go to the German government for funding because they were really struggling during this time thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. However, Hugo decided to launch this massive fundraising campaign to get the money he needed to build the airship, and he was successful. The Graf Zeppelin was completed and officially entered service in the year 1928, and when the public saw this airship for the very first time, they were blown away with what they saw. They could not get over the size and scale of this airship. And on top of all that, the thing actually flew. What you have to remember is during this time, the public did see ships to the size and scale of the Graf Zeppelin. However, they were ocean liners. They were things that floated in the water. They certainly didn't fly. And the fact that the Graf Zeppelin was basically as big as some ships and it actually flew, the public thought it was something out of science fiction. Now, in case you all are wondering what allowed these big airships to fly, don't worry, I will talk about that in the next few minutes. Now, the Graf Zeppelin completed its very first transatlantic flight in the year 1928, and when it arrived in New York City, once again, the public was blown away with the airship. And Hugo Echner captained the Graf Zeppelin during this very first voyage. Now, while this first trip did make the Graf Zeppelin pretty popular, it was what it would do the following year that would make it famous. In the year 1929, the Graf Zeppelin, who was also captained by Hugo Echner during this historic voyage, made a round-the-world flight. And when this was completed, the popularity of the Graf Zeppelin was something out of this world. I can't even describe it. When Hugo Echner returned to Germany, he was seen as a national hero, and the public absolutely adored him for what he achieved. Hugo Echner's popularity grew so much that in the year 1932, he actually considered running for political power. However, during this time, a very dark cloud was forming in Germany. This was the time period where the Nazis were starting to come to power. And just the fact that Hugo Echner was considering running for political power, well, if he did this, he would have actually ran against Hitler, because Hugo Echner hated the Nazis. He hated them. And just the fact that he would run against Hitler made him a big target for the Nazis. They could not believe that he was going to do this, and they were furious with him. However, for personal reasons, Hugo Echner decided not to run for political power. And then in the year 1933, the Nazis did come to power. And believe it or not, they were actually considering arresting Hugo Echner. However, by the time the Nazis came to power, construction of the Hindenburg was already underway, and the Nazis wanted the airship completed so they could use it to push their propaganda. So the arrest of Hugo Echner was canceled. However, they continued to monitor him closely. The Nazis funded the completion of the Hindenburg. However, this did not stop Hugo Echner from criticizing the Nazis every chance he got. In fact, Hugo Echner criticized the Nazis so much, and due to his intense popularity, the Nazis actually decided to ban any printed material from coming out that he had anything to do with. They did this the entire time he was working on the Hindenburg. They basically just needed his expertise, but they decided to silence him so he could not be a threat to the Nazi regime. Now, despite the fact that Hugo did hate the Nazis, the fact remains that the Nazis did help pay for the Hindenburg's completion. So because of this, Hugo was forced, and trust me, he was forced, he would not have done this on his own willingly, to put the Nazi symbol on the rear fins of the Hindenburg. Now, the Hindenburg was going to be built very similarly to the Graf Zeppelin and even the USS Los Angeles before it. And this ship was going to be powered by hydrogen. Hydrogen was the main way that the Hindenburg was going to be able to fly. You see, hydrogen, very much like helium, is lighter than air. So because of this, it allows any vessel that has it in it to float and fly. Now, there is two big differences between helium and hydrogen. The first difference is hydrogen is lighter than helium. So because of this, hydrogen gives an airship more lifting capability than helium. However, unlike helium, hydrogen is way, and I mean way more dangerous. You see, hydrogen is extremely flammable, while helium isn't. So if there's any type of spark where the hydrogen is kept within the Hindenburg, then the entire ship could explode. Inside the Hindenburg, there were going to be these 16 massive bags, otherwise known as cells, and they were going to put hydrogen in each of these cells, and this is what was going to allow the Hindenburg to fly. Now, despite the obvious risks, Hugo had worked around hydrogen airships throughout most of his career, and he knew how to handle them safely, and he never had one major mishap happen to him or any of his hydrogen airships. Other countries had, but Hugo had not. Now, the thing about hydrogen is, despite the fact that it is obviously very dangerous, it's only dangerous if two conditions are met. Number one, the hydrogen has to mix with oxygen, and number two, there has to be an ignition source. Hydrogen without oxygen is harmless. So the trick to using hydrogen safely on an airship is to, number one, keep it contained and away from oxygen and not let a leak happen. And you also have to keep any type of ignition source away from it as well. And honestly, Hugo had great success with this. He never had a major mishap happen with one of his hydrogen airships. Now, it should also be noted that Hugo did consider using helium to provide the lifting capabilities for the Hindenburg. However, what you have to remember is during this time period, helium was extremely rare, and the only major source of helium in the world was the United States. However, the United States did not want to send any helium to Germany for Hugo to use in the Hindenburg. Now, some people do think that one big reason why they did not want to do this was because of the Nazis, and honestly, I am sure that was a big reason. However, officially, there was another reason. You see, in 1927, the U.S. implemented the Helium Control Act, and this prevented the U.S. from sending any helium to other countries. And the big reason they wanted to do this was just to stockpile their helium reserves. And this act was implemented before the Nazis came to power. So, while I am sure the fact that the Nazis were in control of Germany was a big reason why the U.S. did not want to do it, officially, there was the Helium Control Act in place that forbidded helium from going to Germany or any other country for that matter. Now, the Hindenburg was officially completed in the year 1936. However, despite the fact that Hugo immediately wanted to take the airship and put it into passenger service, the Nazis had other ideas. They first seized the airship and began using it to push Nazi propaganda. However, due to the persistence of Hugo, he was soon able to take the airship and do with it as he originally planned, to use it for making passenger trips across the Atlantic. Once the Hindenburg finally entered passenger service, throughout the rest of the 1936 year, things went pretty smoothly for the Hindenburg. The ship operated fine, traveling across the Atlantic, and everybody who flew on the Hindenburg thought it was a fantastic airship. Now, tickets on board the Hindenburg were extremely expensive, even for the time period. A ticket on the Hindenburg cost roughly $450 US. So once you adjust that for inflation, that's somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000 US today. So yeah, traveling on the Hindenburg was very expensive, and it was definitely something that only the wealthy elite could do at that time. Now, the Hindenburg had a maximum carrying capacity of 70 passengers and 61 crew members, so a total of 131 people. Now, another important thing you all need to realize is that the passengers could not occupy the entire space of the Hindenburg. Most of that space was reserved just for the hydrogen. The passengers occupied a small space at the bottom of the ship, kind of close to the front of it, and this is where all the cabins were, where an observation deck was so the passengers could see outside, and so on and so forth. Now, throughout the course of 1936, the Hindenburg would take 10 trips across the Atlantic to North America from Germany, and it would also make 7 trips to Brazil. The Hindenburg's passenger service was interrupted in August of 1936 because the Nazis, once again, wanted to use it as a propaganda machine during the 1936 Olympics. However, after that was over, the Hindenburg resumed passenger operations, and yeah, for the rest of 1936, everything went smoothly for the Hindenburg. However, that can't be said for the year 1937. When the year 1937 rolled around and the Hindenburg entered passenger service once again, I think it'd be safe to say that the fate of the Hindenburg would definitely be changed forever. All right, everybody, well, hey, I hate to do this to all of you, but I think this is the appropriate place to pause the Hindenburg story for now. There is so much information on the Hindenburg, guys, that I definitely am going to have to make this a 2-part series. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed part 1. If you did, be sure you smash that like button and please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot. And I hope you guys tune in once again for part 2 when I finish the story of the Hindenburg disaster. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day, everybody. Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.